In modern social discourse, there exists a widely held assumption that hospitality is universally desired. That inviting people into one's home represents warmth, generosity, and healthy social functioning. Yet, a substantial portion of the population experiences genuine distress at the prospect of hosting guests. Even when those guests are friends or family members they genuinely care about. This isn't about occasional reluctance or the understandable stress of hosting a large event. We're examining individuals for whom the presence of guests in their living space triggers consistent psychological discomfort, anxiety, or exhaustion. People who actively structure their social lives to avoid home-based gatherings, who feel a profound sense of relief when plans to host are cancelled, and who may even experience anticipatory dread days before a scheduled visit. It's essential to establish from the outset that this pattern represents a legitimate variation in human temperament and psychological needs, not a character defect or social inadequacy. These individuals often maintain rich social lives and meaningful relationships. They simply experience a fundamental incompatibility between their psychological architecture and the specific demands of having others occupy their personal territory. Understanding this phenomenon requires us to look beyond superficial explanations like they're just antisocial or they're being difficult. Instead, we must examine the complex interplay of neurobiological tendencies, personality structures, cognitive processing styles, and learned patterns that create this distinct psychological profile. People who experience aversion to hosting guests typically exhibit several identifiable psychological patterns that distinguish them from those who find hospitality energizing or neutral. The most prominent characteristic involves an unusually strong psychological connection between personal space and mental well-being. For these individuals, their home environment functions as more than mere shelter. It operates as an extension of their internal psychological state. The boundaries of their living space correspond to boundaries of self in a way that's more permeable and sensitive than average when others enter this space. It creates a sensation similar to what most people would experience if strangers had access to their private thoughts or personal diary. Research in environmental psychology has identified that some individuals possess what's termed high territorial functioning, a trait characterized by intense emotional investment in spatial control and predictability. These people experience their environment as an active regulator of their nervous system, rather than a passive backdrop to life. Individuals with guest aversion typically demonstrate elevated baseline levels of environmental monitoring. Their attentional systems remain chronically attuned to changes in their surroundings, sounds, movements, spatial arrangements, and especially the presence and emotional states of other people. When guests are present, this monitoring intensifies dramatically. These individuals find themselves unable to disengage from tracking the guest's comfort level, anticipating needs, monitoring for signs of judgment or disapproval, and maintaining continuous awareness of the guest's location and activities within the space. This isn't conscious hospitality, it's an automatic, exhausting hypervigilance that operates below conscious control. These individuals typically show heightened sensitivity to cognitive load, the mental effort required to process information and make decisions. Having guests introduces numerous simultaneous cognitive demands, conversation management, activity coordination, timing logistics, social appropriateness monitoring, and environmental adjustments. While most people can handle this complexity with manageable effort, those with guest aversion experience it as cognitively overwhelming, leading to mental fatigue that can persist for hours or even days after guests depart. A defining characteristic involves the role of solitary time in psychological restoration. For these individuals, their home serves as the primary, sometimes the only, environment where deep psychological restoration occurs. This restoration requires not just physical rest, but the complete suspension of social performance, environmental vigilance, and interpersonal accommodation. The presence of guests directly interferes with this restoration process, creating a form of psychological debt. Even after guests leave, these individuals often report that their space feels different and requires a reclamation period before full comfort returns. The development of guest aversion emerges from multiple psychological mechanisms operating across neurobiological, temperamental, and processing dimensions. Foundational research in personality psychology has established that introversion, characterized by decreased dopaminergic reward sensitivity to external stimulation, predisposes individuals toward finding social interaction more depleting than rewarding. Introverts typically require longer recovery periods after social engagement and experience social interaction as drawing from limited energy reserves rather than replenishing them. When combined with sensory processing, sensitivity, a trait involving deeper processing of sensory information and stronger emotional responsiveness to environmental stimuli, the presence of guests creates a perfect storm of overstimulation. The guest represents simultaneous social stimulation, environmental disruption, and sensory novelty, all occurring in the space these individuals rely upon for sensory down-regulation. Attachment theory provides another explanatory framework. Individuals who develop certain attachment patterns, particularly avoidant attachment or anxious attachment with compensatory independence, often establish their homes as secure bases from which they can safely engage with the external world. The home becomes psychologically coded as safe, specifically because it's separate from the social world and its attendant uncertainties. When guests enter this space, the categorical distinction between safe internal space and uncertain external social world collapses. The secure base becomes compromised, triggering activation of attachment-related anxiety that manifests as discomfort, irritability, or withdrawal even toward people they genuinely like. Neurocognitive research suggests that individual differences in executive function, particularly in task-switching ability and divided attention capacity, contribute significantly to hosting comfort. Some individuals possess cognitive architectures optimized for sustained, focused engagement with limited variables. These people excel in environments where they can maintain consistent mental frameworks and minimize context switching. Hosting guests requires continuous task switching, from conversation to hospitality actions, from internal concerns to external awareness, from one guest's needs to another's. For individuals whose executive function systems struggle with rapid cognitive flexibility, this creates persistent mental friction that registers as stress and exhaustion. Individual differences in hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis functioning affect how people respond to the low-level but sustained stressors involved in hosting. Some individuals possess stress response systems with lower activation thresholds and slower recovery trajectories. For these people, the mild but persistent activation triggered by guest presence, the vigilance, the performance demands, the unpredictability, creates a sustained cortisol elevation that feels subjectively uncomfortable and produces lingering fatigue. This isn't about dramatic stress reactions, but rather about how efficiently the nervous system can maintain elevated alertness without depleting psychological resources. While temperamental factors provide the foundation, environmental conditioning and social learning shape how strongly and in what specific ways guest aversion manifests. Childhood experiences with guests in the family home create powerful associative learning. Children who grew up in households where guest visits were associated with parental stress, financial strain, intense cleaning demands, or family conflict may develop conditioned anxiety responses to hosting. The child learns, often implicitly, that guests equal disruption, tension, or the temporary loss of parental emotional availability. Conversely, children raised in homes with extremely rigid hospitality standards, where guest visits required extensive preparation, behavioral control, and performance of specific social scripts, may come to associate hosting with oppressive perfectionism and the anxiety of potential failure. Observing parents who themselves displayed discomfort with guests, or who frequently complained about hosting obligations, provides a direct behavioral model that normalizes guest aversion and validates it as an acceptable adult response. The relationship between economic security and hosting comfort cannot be overlooked. Individuals who experienced economic instability, particularly during formative years, often develop heightened anxiety about their living spaces being evaluated or judged. The prospect of guests triggers concerns about whether their home, furnishings, or food offerings meet social standards. This anxiety persists even after economic circumstances improve. Thus, because the evaluative lens has become internalized, the guest's presence activates deep-seated concerns about adequacy that extend far beyond the objective quality of the hosting experience. Different cultural contexts carry vastly different expectations regarding hospitality, and individuals from cultures with extensive hospitality obligations may experience guest aversion as particularly distressing because it conflicts with deeply embedded cultural values. The internal conflict between temperamental inclination and cultural expectation intensifies the discomfort, adding layers of guilt and shame to the base anxiety about hosting. Similarly, gender socialization, particularly for women in cultures where domestic hosting falls predominantly to female family members, creates additional psychological burden. The individual may experience guest aversion not just as personal discomfort, but as failure to fulfill gendered role expectations. Contemporary urban and suburban living patterns have shifted privacy expectations significantly. Many individuals now experience their homes as rare refuges from the constant social exposure of modern life. Workplace open offices, social media visibility, and urban density all contribute to privacy deprivation in other life domains for people living in these contexts. The home becomes increasingly precious as the final private territory. Guest presence then represents the last remaining private space being compromised, intensifying the protective response far beyond what might have developed in contexts with more distributed privacy opportunities. Perhaps most significantly, Number one, guest aversion strengthens through negative reinforcement. Each time an individual successfully avoids hosting, whether through suggesting alternative locations, declining to extend invitations, or cancelling plans, they experience immediate anxiety relief. This relief powerfully reinforces the avoidance behavior, making future hosting feel progressively more difficult. Simultaneously, decreased frequency of hosting means these individuals never develop the habituation that regular exposure might provide, nor do they accumulate positive hosting experiences that could counterbalance their anxiety. The pattern becomes self-perpetuating. Like all personality variations, the psychological profile associated with guest aversion carries both adaptive advantages and genuine limitations. Individuals with guest aversion often demonstrate exceptional capacity for solitary focus and productivity. Their ability to use their home environment for deep restoration and concentrated work, undistracted by social obligations, frequently translates into significant professional and creative accomplishments. Many writers, researchers, artists, and technical professionals who produce substantial solo work share this psychological profile. These individuals typically develop sophisticated self-awareness regarding their social energy management. Unlike people who overextend themselves socially out of obligation or inability to recognize their limits, those with guest aversion maintain clearer boundaries that protect them from burnout. They become skilled at alternative forms of social engagement that better match their temperament, meeting friends at neutral locations, maintaining relationships through technology, or engaging in parallel activities that provide connection without the specific demands of hosting. The strong territorial boundaries that contribute to hosting discomfort also support healthy psychological autonomy. These individuals rarely struggle with excessive people-pleasing or boundary violations in other life domains, because they've developed robust internal sensing of when their personal needs are being compromised. Additionally, their heightened environmental awareness often translates into aesthetic sensitivity and the ability to create beautifully curated personal spaces. Because their homes serve such crucial psychological functions, they invest substantial care in making these environments precisely suited to their needs, a skill that can extend to professional domains like design, architecture, or environmental psychology. The most obvious challenge involves potential social friction and misunderstanding. In social contexts where hosting is expected or where declining to host is interpreted as rejection or snobbery, these individuals may experience relationship strain or social isolation. Friends and family may misinterpret their reluctance as lack of care or investment in the relationship, creating hurt feelings and defensiveness on both sides. The cognitive distortions that often accompany guest aversion can become problematic. Many individuals with this pattern catastrophize potential hosting scenarios. The Freire quote, "Imagining disaster or harsh judgment that rarely manifests in reality. This anticipatory anxiety consumes mental resources and may cause them to miss potentially positive social experiences. For those who live with partners or family members who don't share this temperament, guest aversion can create significant household conflict. Disagreements about hosting frequency, preparation standards, or guest duration may become recurring sources of tension, particularly when one partner experiences the other's discomfort as unreasonable or controlling. Parent-child relationships present particular challenges. Parents with guest aversion may struggle to accommodate their children's social needs for playdates and gatherings, potentially impacting the child's social development or creating feelings of embarrassment. The parent must navigate between their genuine psychological discomfort and their responsibility to support their child's social growth. Career limitations may emerge in fields where networking, client entertainment, or home-based business functions are expected. These individuals may find themselves at professional disadvantage, or may need to invest additional resources in alternative hosting locations. Perhaps most significantly, the pattern can become rigidly entrenched over time, narrowing life possibilities. What begins as preference may calcify into inflexible anxiety that limits spontaneity, prevents potentially enriching experiences. 2 and creates increasing isolation as social circles naturally gravitate toward people who reciprocate hosting. Understanding the psychological mechanisms underlying guest aversion enables both affected individuals and those around them to develop more effective approaches. Gradual exposure remains one of the most evidence-supported approaches for managing hosting anxiety, rather than attempting to host traditional gatherings immediately. Individuals can benefit from structured progression, beginning with very brief visits from a single trusted person, explicitly time-limiting the visit, and gradually extending duration and guest numbers as comfort increases. The key is maintaining control throughout the process to prevent overwhelming anxiety that would reinforce avoidance. Reframing the psychological meaning of hosting can reduce anticipatory anxiety. Many individuals catastrophize guest visits as high-stakes performances subject to judgment. Cognitive restructuring techniques, examining evidence for feared outcomes, identifying cognitive distortions, and developing more realistic expectations can diminish the subjective threat level of hosting situations. Establishing explicit boundaries and structures reduces the ambiguity that drives much hosting anxiety. This might include communicating clear start and end times for visits, designating certain rooms as off-limits to guests, or openly discussing hosting limitations with friends and family. When guests understand these boundaries aren't personal rejections but genuine needs, relationships can often accommodate the structure comfortably, creating hosting formats that align with individual strengths rather than fighting against temperament proves more sustainable. For example, some people find structured activities like board game nights or movie screenings less draining than open-ended social time, because they reduce conversational demands and provide clear frameworks. Others discover that co-hosting distributes the cognitive load more manageably. Implementing post-visit restoration rituals helps process the experience and restore equilibrium. This might involve specific cleaning routines that psychologically reclaim the space, deliberate solitary time before resuming normal activities, or even simple practices like opening windows to refresh the environment after guests leave. Partners and family members of individuals with guest aversion benefit from understanding that the discomfort is neurobiologically rooted, WZ, rather than willful or manipulative. Approaching the situation with curiosity rather than judgment, asking questions like, what specifically feels hardest about hosting, rather than, why can't you just be normal about this, creates space for collaborative problem solving. Couples can develop compromise structures, alternating between hosting at their home and other locations, one partner handling most hosting logistics while the other manages other household responsibilities. Or agreeing on a sustainable hosting frequency that honors both partners' needs. For parents with hosting aversion, transparency adapted to the child's age can be surprisingly effective. Children can understand that mom's or dad's brain feels very tired when lots of people are here without interpreting it as rejection of the friends themselves. Parents can compensate by facilitating social connections in other venues, ensuring the child's social needs are met even if the home isn't the primary location. Friends of individuals with hosting reluctance can support the relationship by explicitly communicating that they value the friendship independent of hosting, suggesting alternative meeting locations, and avoiding interpretation of hosting reluctance as personal rejection. Questions like, would you prefer to meet out somewhere? Normalize the preference without forcing disclosure or justification. Educational and workplace environments can reduce hosting pressure by normalizing diverse social preferences. When social connection is facilitated through multiple formats rather than assuming home-based gathering as the default, individuals with various temperaments can participate comfortably. Cultural communities might benefit from examining whether hospitality expectations serve their intended purpose of strengthening connection, or have become rigid obligations that create burden without benefit. Creating sanctioned alternatives, community spaces for gathering, rotating hosting responsibilities, or explicit permission structures for hosting limitations can preserve cultural connection while accommodating temperamental diversity. Mental health professionals working with clients experiencing hosting-related distress should conduct careful assessment to distinguish temperamental variation from clinically significant anxiety disorders. While the patterns overlap, the distinction matters for treatment planning. Temperamental guest aversion may require acceptance and adaptation strategies. First one done. While anxiety disorders might benefit from targeted exposure, therapy, and anxiety management techniques, certain patterns indicate that guest aversion has crossed from temperamental variation into clinically significant impairment, when avoidance severely limits life opportunities, when anticipatory anxiety is constant and debilitating, when the pattern creates serious relationship ruptures, or when it's accompanied by other anxiety symptoms that pervade multiple life domains. In these cases, consultation with mental health professionals specializing in anxiety disorders may be appropriate. The psychology of individuals who experience genuine discomfort with having guests in their homes reflects the complex interaction of temperament, neurobiology, learned associations, and environmental context. This pattern is neither pathology nor character flaw, but rather represents one point on the spectrum of human social preferences and needs. At its core, guest aversion typically emerges from the convergence of introverted temperament, sensory processing sensitivity, specific cognitive processing styles, and learned associations that together create a psychological architecture in which the home environment serves critical restoration functions that guest presence inherently disrupts. Environmental factors, from family modeling to cultural expectations to socioeconomic concerns, shape how these tendencies manifest and how much distress they generate, like all psychological patterns. Question carries both advantages and limitations. The same territorial sensitivity and need for solitary restoration that makes hosting uncomfortable often supports creative productivity, healthy boundaries, and sophisticated self-awareness. Yet the pattern can also create social friction, limit spontaneity, and become rigidly constraining when it calcifies into inflexible avoidance. The most functional approach involves neither forcing these individuals to host against their genuine psychological grain down, nor allowing avoidance to become so complete that it narrows life possibilities. Instead, boundary communication, reframing of hosting meaning, and development of alternative social formats can create sustainable balance. Understanding human behavioral diversity requires recognizing that optimal functioning looks different across individuals. For some, an open door and frequent gatherings represent psychological health and generous spirit. For others, a more selective, boundaried approach to home hospitality serves identical goals of maintaining meaningful relationships while protecting the psychological resources necessary for well-being. The goal is not conformity to a single social standard, but rather the development of self-awareness adaptive strategies, and social environments flexible enough to accommodate the genuine diversity of human temperament and need. When we approach these differences with curiosity rather than judgment, both individuals and communities benefit from the full range of human psychological variation.